Welcome to this ECG webinar using mixed methods in fragile and conflict-affected situations, FCAS, and small island developing states, SIDS evaluations. It's really good to see you all, and thank you very much for being here. My name is Joanne Asquith, and I am a director in the Asian Development Bank's Independent Evaluation Department. My division focuses on thematic and country level evaluations. I'm really looking forward to an informal and interesting discussion on the topic of using mixed methods in fragile and conflict affected situations, what we term as FCAS, and small island developing states, SIDS. So you'll hear FCAS being used a lot by ADB staff, and World Bank staff are going to use FCS because they don't pronounce the A in FCAS, so it's silent. So try not to get confused. I get confused by that, but it's often referred to as well as fragility, conflict, and violence. So this is an informal session, and it's largely about methods and what hampers evaluation in FCAS and SIDS settings, and what evaluation methods we can use to overcome these constraints. But the discussion might also venture into evaluation findings and other factors. So joining me today are Hyun Son, who's the Principal Evaluation Specialist in IED at the Asian Development Bank. We also have Stefan Wegner, who's a Senior Evaluation Officer looking at fragility, conflict, and violence at the Independent Evaluation Group at the World Bank. And we're also joined by David Hill, who's ADB's Country Director in Papua New Guinea. And he's been there for quite a few years now, right, David? Probably coming up more than 4 years. I mean, you've been there for a while, so you really understand what it is to work in a fragile setting. Before I turn to the panel, let me just give you a little bit of background of why we're holding this seminar and what I hope you'll get from today's seminar. So just a little bit about background. The last time we conducted an evaluation of ADB's operations in fragile countries was in 2011. So well over a decade ago now, and it's quite a significant gap given the state of the world and the increase in fragility, conflict, and violence that we tend to see. And to make up for this gap, we included a chapter on fragility in our annual evaluation report. So it was a pretty rapid assessment of ADB and other donors' support to FCAS. Because it was quite a rapid assessment, we didn't make any recommendations. But even so, the evaluation, it was an evaluation, and it did generate interesting findings, and that's what we'd like to share with you today. What I hope you will get out of this webinar is some useful information on methods for evaluation in FCAS, and an overview of some of the issues we face in FCAS evaluation, and hopefully some useful findings. And I hope this is an opportunity to share your thoughts with colleagues who are based across the world. So let me pass over to Hyun first, who's going to make a short presentation on the evaluation that she led. That's going to be followed by Stefan, who's going to also talk about evaluation in FCAS, but leaning towards private sector operations. And then we'll hear from David, who's going to talk about self-evaluation and the reality on the ground. So these are going to be short presentations, and hopefully there'll be enough time at the end to get questions from you, but also to hear your stories and your experiences on conducting evaluations in difficult, complex settings, well, in FCAS and SIDS. So thank you, and let me pass over to Hyun. Thanks, Hyun.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are joining from. Welcome to IED's pre-ECG session on using mixed methods in evaluations in FCAS and SIDS. So for this presentation, we'll use a simple definition of mixed methods. That is, mixed method evaluation systematically integrates two or more evaluation methods, potentially at every stage of the evaluation process, usually drawing on both quantitative and qualitative methods data. In our AR theme chapter, special chapter on FCAS and SIDS, we used a combination of quantitative and qualitative methods. So for the quantitative methods, we used the following. Number one, regression analysis. This regression analysis was used to analyze key factors that help countries exit from fragility based on a set of economic, social, governance, and environmental variables. The cross-country regressions identified factors that are likely to help countries transition out of fragility, or factors that are likely to trap countries in fragility. And number two, portfolio analysis. We used it to understand the overall trends in ADB support to FCAS and SIDS over 2013 to 2020 across sectors, types of operations, and portfolio performance indicators like design readiness and procurement readiness. And number three, staff perception survey. We designed the online survey to understand staff's perception on ADB's engagement in FCAS and SIDS. Our team administered the survey to ADB staff from HQ and registered missions. And we received a very high response rate of nearly 70%. So the evaluation team applied statistical tools like chi-square and others to test whether there was a statistically significant difference in the responses of ADB staff by departments, duty stations in HQ or registered missions, or staff categories and sectoral expertise, among others. For the qualitative methods, we conducted the following. Number one, comparative analysis of the approaches of various IFIs to FCAS and SIDS. And this comparative analysis delved into FCAS and SIDS approaches or strategies of IFIs like African Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, IMF, Islamic Development Bank, and the World Bank. So it helped us identify issues and challenges these IFIs face in implementing their FCAS and SIDS approaches and the mitigating measures. Number two, consultation meetings. We conducted consultation meetings with the ADB staff working in headquarters and registered missions, and also sector and thematic groups. And we also conducted consultation meetings with representatives of IFIs, which I mentioned previously. And number three, we reviewed project documents and other literature relating to FCAS. So here, I mean, we focused on ADB project documents, country partnership strategies, and FCAS and SIDS operational plan and approach, and all this sort of thing. Of course, I mean, we also reviewed the external studies on development effectiveness in FCAS and SIDS. So based on the quantitative and qualitative methods I just highlighted in the previous two slides, I will briefly discuss the key findings that emerged from those methods. There are quite a bit of it, so maybe I can pick around 3 of them. The first one comes from portfolio analysis. And then the second one, I thought this is quite interesting because that comes from document review, consultation meetings, and also from perception survey. That finding was ADB support for FCAS and SIDS has increased since 2013. But what we found was that ADB staff reported limited clarity as to what a differentiate approach is. So differentiate approach is ADB's guiding principle for its FCAS and SIDS approach. But ADB staff indicated during consultation meetings that it's not clear to them what a differentiate approach means in practice. And our perception survey provided staff's insights as to how the differentiate approach can be defined and operationalized. So according to 46% of the survey respondents, implementing risk-based strategic planning and business processes at the country and project levels is the best way to support differentiated approach. That's one of the findings. And given the severity of capacity and human capital constraints in FCAS and SIDS, long-term engagement and on-the-ground capacity development support are imperative. So executing and implementing agencies in FCAS and SIDS require constant and continuous capacity development support throughout all project cycle stages, in part because of high staff turnover in government agencies and limited pool of talents. Maybe David later on can highlight this issue in the context of PNG and other Pacific SIDS. So MDBs like ADB are implementing various interventions to address capacity constraints in FCAS and SIDS using modalities like short and long-term technical assistance and project readiness financing facilities. In addition, IFIs are also using capacity supplementation to help address severe capacity constraints, especially in Pacific SIDS. And we also found that MDBs are increasingly moving towards the concept of resilience and away from fragility in supporting FCAS and SIDS. For instance, Islamic Development Bank now uses its resilience index to address drivers of fragility and conflict. Similarly, we found that African Development Bank is also using the concept of resilience instead of fragility. So such a shift will involve greater emphasis on prevention mechanisms. So development organizations can focus on countries at risk of falling into fragile states. For instance, World Bank and IMF are conducting fragility and resilience assessments, even for countries not in their official FCAS list. So here, triangulation design is the most common and well-known approach to mix the methods when it comes to evaluation. So for instance, in our document reviews, a key finding that emerged was that ADB FCAS classification system did not fully reflect various drivers of fragility and conflict. That's because ADB system was largely based on average score of 3.2 or less, based on ADB's country performance assessment, which is equivalent to World Bank's CPIA, or the presence of United Nations peacekeeping forces in the past 3 years. So they use these two criteria to classify a country as FCAS. So to confirm or cross-validate these findings, we used the findings of one of our quantitative methods, which I mentioned. That is results from our staff perception survey. So according to our survey, the respondents indicated the presence of subnational conflicts as an additional factor that should be included in ADB's FCAS classification system, while 62% deemed that ADB classification system should take account of issues associated with refugees or people displaced by conflict or violence. What are the challenges and opportunities to using mixed methods in FCAS and SIDS context? So on challenges, number one is attribution. So attribution is a usual problem when evaluating development impact or interventions, but it's more pronounced in FCAS and SIDS given the fluid and often nonlinear change processes in this context. And number two, complexity of design and implementation of interventions in FCAS and SIDS mean higher likelihood of projects deviating from their original designs to adapt to changing environments. So it may be difficult to identify what to be evaluated. And number three, sensitivity of political and social issues. I mean, these sensitivity issues may limit the range of data that can be collected. Then to overcome these challenges, the mixed method approach helped our team first to achieve necessary evaluation rigor to make the best possible use of available quantitative and qualitative data. Second, to support the feedback loops that can guide the ADB staff in making changes to achieve development outcomes in FCAS and SIDS context. And third, to foster not just accountability, but also learning from what strategies or interventions worked and what didn't work. So finally, in reporting conclusions and recommendations or lessons, it's important to determine the needs and interests of our target audience. So we as evaluators should identify sound, robust, evidence-based conclusions and actionable recommendations or lessons. So there are a few conclusions that have emerged from our theme chapter. So these are as follows. One, ADB has long recognized the need to engage continually and work differently in FCAS and SIDS, but it can do much better in addressing country-specific drivers of fragility and conflict in these countries, especially institutional or structural fragilities faced by small island developing states. And number two, building resilience in FCAS and SIDS requires multidimensional approach to addressing fragility and conflict risk. And number three, partnership. ADB's partnerships with the UN agencies and other humanitarian actors on the ground have increased over time. And these partnerships among development agencies can help to close gaps in financing and responses by bridging relief and development. And finally, limited conflict or fragility sensitiveness of ADB's monitoring frameworks make it difficult to assess whether and to what extent FCAS and SIDS are transitioning out of the fragility and conflict spectrum. So this concludes my presentation. Thank you very much. Back to you, Joanne.
Hyun, thank you very much indeed. My mind focused on one thing that you said, which was that projects deviate from their original design, and it made me think that, you know, donors and MDBs in particular need to become much more adaptive at working in these contexts. And it made me think of real-time evaluation and self-evaluation, which we'll come on to. And I think that Stephen might be talking about these things as well. So Stefan, can I hand over to you to talk about your experience in evaluating in fragile and conflict-affected states and SIDS?
Yes, thank you very much, Joanne, and thanks, Hyun, for this great presentation. I mean, I see a lot of resonance between our findings and your findings in terms of the implications, the findings, the next steps, and also, you know, some of the methodological issues that you struggled with, that I think, you know, will also be surfaced in our evaluation, and in our presentation. So I will focus my remarks mainly on methodological issues, but would be happy to also review a few key findings of the recent evaluation that we've concluded. As Joanne mentioned, an assessment of private sector effectiveness in supporting investments and development impact in fragile and conflict-affected states. This evaluation also identified key factors that are constraining private sector investment and the scaling up of activities of MDBs and DFIs, such as IFC Amiga, as well as trade-offs that these actors should consider as they're moving forward. So in keeping with the theme of this session, I wanted to take a step back and perhaps just mention a few of the specific characteristics and challenges to evaluation in FCAS and SIDS countries, which really require us to do things differently and adapt our approaches, very much in line with what Joanne just concluded from Hyun's presentation. I will then speak about how we try to address and mitigate these issues in our evaluation, and close with some observations about the challenges that we faced as evaluators when we conducted the study. So the kinds of things that we struggled with, or, you know, considerations for, you know, for future discussion. So what are the challenges to evaluating FCS and SIDS operations and programs? So why, do we need to adapt the what and the how of evaluating? So I think FCS have special challenges, which may include, the lack of data, the lack of access to project sites due to conflict or insecurity, heightened risk and uncertainty when implementing assistance programs, where conditions on the ground can really shift constantly, as we've seen very recently with Afghanistan, with the Sahel, with other countries. The weak capacity to implement programs and to monitor and report results. And also this issue about attribution, which Hyun has already mentioned. Finally, typically the involvement of many different donors that may sometimes work in the same sector and whose activities may not be fully coordinated or even planned. So in my view, these issues actually make mixed methods the approach of choice to address evaluation and monitoring in FCAS and SIDS environments. And they also, of course, affect and how we can apply these methods in practice. So in our evaluation, how did we use and adapt this mixed methods approach to the specific evaluation question? We used very similar methods as the ADB team. And in my view, qualitative and quantitative methods and approaches serve different but very complementary purposes and also help us to triangulate findings. So in our evaluation, quantitative analysis fed into the assessment of relevance of output questions, were investments actually delivered? Where were they done? What were the results? Qualitative analysis then went a step further on the learning agenda and allowed us to really probe transmission mechanisms, right? So what worked under what circumstances? So this already shows that this using both methods gives us a broader picture of findings and a much richer context for the evaluation. We used then several strategies to address or mitigate the challenges about evaluation and monitoring in FCS that I noted earlier. So on data scarcity and the limited availability to collect primary data in FCAS, I think in general, in FCS and in SIDS, we have to rely much more on existing data. And so in our case, we included external sources on FDI, on private investment, on country and credit risk, on fragility assessments and so on. And we also conducted textual analysis of textual data, of analytical work that have been conducted on fragility assessments, etc., to bring this information to bear for our evaluation. As a parenthesis, the World Bank IEG has also begun using geospatial analysis in a few evaluations, which also helps address the relevance questions. We did not for this particular evaluation, but we could come back to this topic in the questions of answers and answers of why and why not, given also the methodological challenges with geospatial. Another point was a greater focus on learning from others. And this also emphasizes something that Hyun has already said. So in order to understand what's going on in FCS, we wanted to learn from comparator institutions about their approaches to support private sector activities in FCAS and SIDS. So we interviewed about 10 or 12 institutions that are supporting these activities to understand their approaches, their experiences, and how they've shifted based on their learnings. And we've also increased the emphasis on stakeholder interviews in this evaluation. We used country case studies to help us understand the contribution of activities and programs to results and to test the theory of change. And lastly, we also conducted additional background work to home in on institutional issues, corporate issues that we had identified in an earlier stocktake were important bottlenecks or constraints. So one was on human resources and incentives for staff working on FCAS countries, implications for the financial bottom line of the institution, and other specifically commission pieces that have enriched the evaluative database. Now, I wanted to turn to some of the challenges and some of the issues that we've struggled with as we applied this mixed methods approach. So which issues did we encounter? A couple come to mind. So one is that the volatility, the constant changes on the ground that I mentioned earlier, actually lead to a very volatile situation in FCAS countries, and make an evaluation, be out of date. By the end of our evaluation, there had been a coup d'etat in Myanmar, Afghanistan, the government had been toppled, and there were various other crises from Ethiopia to Haiti to the Sahel. So I think that is an important challenge in terms of, what are we reporting, the findings from, before the setback, or, what is the right way to evaluate this risk and uncertainty that is a major characteristic of FCAS and SIDS countries. Now, similarly, internally to the institutions, there's also a rapid evolution of DFI approaches and instruments, which really make this a moving target. There was a move towards doing more upstream work, etc., which was not yet evaluable. So I think that calls for, the timing and the scope of the evaluation is important, and also, to be very clear what we can assess or we cannot assess yet. Heterogeneity of FCS contexts and circumstances. So, one country is unlike any other, and this really limits our ability to generalize findings from one country context to another country. So what works in Haiti, will likely not work in Mali or in Afghanistan. So the need to be really specific, context specific when we talk about findings. And finally, many DFIs and agencies work on similar issues. Actually, all of the DFIs that we interviewed had very similar strategies or policy notes to work on business enabling environment, on developing a project pipeline, but they mostly do it alone. And these activities are not evaluated together. So I think this may be an important gap, the need to look at the coherence of support in particular sectors to make sure that there's no gaps, no overlaps of assistance. And I wanted to end with a comment, with a very important question, actually, about the what we evaluate. So how do we actually know we're doing the right thing, right? And so we found that there was very scarce information on contributing to higher level objectives in FCAS and SIDS countries. So issues around peace building, resilience, capturing unintended effects that may either ameliorate or exacerbate fragilities. There was virtually no information that we could find in any project documentation or through any interviews. So, that means, so how do we need to adapt theories of change and indicators to capture these broader, higher level objectives that are actually related to addressing or not addressing underlying drivers of fragility? I think that's a very important gap. And I'm going to leave you with a somewhat provocative statement from a recent report of a special inspector general for Afghanistan from the United States, who summarized this conundrum quite nicely. And there's a sentence there that says, there is a risk of doing the wrong thing perfectly. And so I think there is a risk of monitoring the wrong thing perfectly. Thank you very much. Back to you, Joanne.
Wow, we could do the wrong thing. We could do the wrong thing perfectly, right? That's a scary thought, and it is very provocative. And I also like what you said about context and how quickly everything can change, how suddenly everything can change. And therefore, there is this issue about, is what we learn in Papua New Guinea applicable to Afghanistan? And is that also applicable to Haiti and elsewhere? So we really need to understand what works and in what context, and be really specific about the context. And yet it's quite difficult to be specific about the context. And I think that segue brings us cleverly to David. We're lucky today to have David Hill with us, who is not an evaluator. Yes, there are people out there who don't evaluate. And David has been in Papua New Guinea now for quite a number of years. And David, it would be really good to hear from you about, how differently ADB and other donor partners work in a context like Papua New Guinea. I mean, I know you've also worked in Afghanistan, so you've had quite a lot of experience on the ground. So it would be really good to hear more about this concept of differentiation and what it means in practice. And yeah, thank you very much, and over to you. Cheers.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Joanne, and thank you for everybody else participating. And indeed, I also in previous career, I also spent some time, quite considerable time in the Vanuatu in the Solomon Islands, and and each of these countries is different. I guess we'll come back to that a little bit more. But so today, though, I would just say, I will focus on PNG. In PNG, we have completed a number of project completion reports in the last few years. And these projects that we've done the completion reports for now in 2019, 2020, 21 are dated going back to when they were approved in 2009, 2010, 2011, which I would say was a different era in ADB project design. On one hand, we had some TAs that were quite large in producing the project concept and design. I mean, quite significant. We used to have TAs in ADB that were $4 or $5 million. And then these days, these TAs have shrunk to usually about an average of $1 or $2 million. But then at the same time, in the past, the project readiness filters were not as rigid. And I would say as an institution, ADB was much more siloed in terms of our investments between sovereign operations and non-sovereign operations, and indeed between different sectors that might be complementary, and indeed between different development partners. So I think these things are important to keep in context. Now I do have I have about 5 or 6 key observations on our recent PCRs, but I also was asked about donor coordination in PNG. So perhaps I will start with that. PNG is our largest Pacific Island country, and it's a very large country, being about 9 million population, and quite a large, quite a vast and differentiated geography. But nonetheless, there is strong donor coordination, which is generally led by the government of Australia, in concert with the United Nations and with the government's planning department. We usually have monthly meetings, and we have an open forum to discuss matters and the like. But the government is really the body that's tasked with providing development partner coordination. So if that doesn't happen in a sector, that's I would be remiss to say that's not really the problem of the development partners, but really more about what is the government doing to facilitate development partner coordination, because there is quite a lot of funding available, but it needs to be coordinated in a proper manner. I'm jumping ahead here because I think this relates to one of my observations on our PCR. So perhaps maybe I will jump back to that, given the time we are allowed. I have 5 or 6 observations of our recent PCRs. The first is that the project concept that we developed for a particular project did not consider related investments. So this is, again, in my mind, it relates to donor and development partner coordination. So investments in a particular sector or the like were not necessarily designed in a way to complement other investments. This could have been in the same sector. For instance, a downstream project such as a distribution system in electrification financed by a different development partner might have been highly dependent on a different development partner. And it doesn't matter whether it was a grant or a loan. But what happens if one project is delayed or postponed, or indeed doesn't go through due to various issues? Then what happens with that other one? So for instance, you could have a project in the energy sector focused on distribution and generation. It could be all grant financed, but then the generation component, it could have been loan financed, but it didn't work. Maybe it didn't happen due to procurement issues and it was canceled. Well, then what do you do with the transmission and the distribution? The free money that for a project that was about distribution and transmission, if the generation didn't occur. So that there is that issue. So I would mention that as the first issue. The second issue, which I think is coming up more and more today with the issue with global inflation and commodity prices, is that for one reason or another, cost estimates and time estimates for project implementation seem to ignore or disregard available evidence from previous or ongoing projects. Time after time, we have examples that projects take longer than expected, projects cost longer than expected, yet perhaps due to institutional bias or poor quality of the consultants, poor understanding of the country conditions or the site-specific conditions, and maybe indeed a institutional bias, we end up with some optimistic bias on costs and time, and project gets approved, but in the end, the realized costs, realized time is much higher than what we envisaged. And that's a big issue. And then the project performance rating in the end suffers. Third, and related to my second point, is the lack of internal coordination. In the past, again, this might relate to a different era in ADB processing and operations. Many times the project processing is self-contained or siloed in headquarters in Manila, and you have project teams parachuting in to the country to ascertain the conditions and the like, and undertake the project design. And maybe they don't quite fully grasp the complexity of the environment in which they are working. And in many cases, maybe the local staff, i.e. national staff, which in the past, the RMs were more staffed with local staff than international staff, weren't listened to properly. And then once the project is approved, project would get handed off to the RMs to implement. And this has been a big issue, because in many cases, once the projects were handed off to the RM staff, there was insufficient resources to implement these projects, and indeed, perhaps these projects weren't designed properly. Maybe at the design stage, if they had better input from the resident missions, key indicators in the design and monitoring framework would have been more realistic. Cost estimates would have been more realistic. And indeed, implementation times may have been more realistic. So that again, I believe this is a legacy issue, because I think last few years and moving forward, ADB has been striving to have more integrated teams between the RM and headquarters in terms of processing. But nonetheless, as we go through this stage, because there is such a lag in the way between project processing and implementation, and then indeed evaluation, we are going to see a number of projects that have been completed in recent years that were approved way back in, perhaps 10 years ago, that did not have this spirit of esprit de corps between headquarters and the resident missions, and I think some of those projects will suffer. Fourth, a key implementation bottleneck is procurement delays. We've had some procurement reforms in ADB. We've generally followed World Bank procurement reforms. And indeed, we've tried to increase project readiness in terms of our design, such that it's more easy to move to procurement before approval. But nonetheless, procurement takes a long time, especially in FCAS countries, due to capacity development issues. Procurement can take a year, very easily a year. And so there's a mixture between lack of capacity in the governments we work with, particularly in FCAS countries, as well as our own internal bureaucratic processes that take a long time. And yes, procurement delays are a key bottleneck to implementation, and surely the longer it takes time to procure and implement, the longer it's going to cost, and the decrease in the economic return stream and the performance of the project is going to be affected. Fifth and last, well, no, not quite lastly, but particularly in FCAS, the capacity of our EAs is lacking. We do try to provide a sufficient capacity development in all of our projects. I think that's been going on since Strategy 2020, not to mention 2030. But I'm not sure if we're really making inroads here on capacity development. Yes, we spend money. Yes, we provide international consultants to project implementation units, project management offices, et cetera, but is it really changing the ability of those in governments, especially our developing member countries on the lower end, and which includes FCAS and SIDS, to be able to undertake these things themselves? So that is also an issue. And then lastly, particularly again in our in some of our DMCs that are FCAS and SIDS, counterpart funding is lacking. So what do you do? What do you do if the government does not have sufficient financing to make up their share, their cost share? This has an impact on project implementation. ADB, we can often front load our funding and push the funding in the back, but if it comes to a crunch time, as we are going to experience because of inflation, wherein our cost estimates are probably going to be are probably not going to be close to what the realized cost is, we are certainly going to need that government counterpart funding. In the past, sometimes we got away with it when the realized cost was less than what we estimated, given contingencies and provisional sums. But moving forward with inflation, if the realized costs are significantly greater than the cost estimates, we are not going to be able to get away without having the government counterpart financing. And I know in particular in Png, there was one project in particular, we didn't have the government counterpart financing. Our financing ran out. We had to stop work. Contractor had to demobilize. Much additional costs. And again, it affects project performance in terms of when the project is completed and we have the return on the investment. I won't get in. I guess I feel like I've spoken too much. I don't want to get into the differentiated approach right now, but we can come back to that if time permits. But I figure I will stop here and then we can have questions and answers and go from there. Thank you very much.
David, look, thank you. I think that was a really frank overview of some of the problems that you face in operations. You know, the overambition that we have often in these countries, the disjointedness, not just across donors, but within our own organizations, lack of internal coordination, parachuting in, procurement delays, and capacity. And it made me think, are we learning? I mean, is learning going on? And I wanted to start with that question and ask Stefan. Stefan, do you think we're learning? And as evaluators, are we making these points enough? Are we making these points strongly enough in our evaluations? I mean, what are we also missing as evaluators? Because David highlighted some very simple things, which are not just which you don't just find in fragile states, right? You find them in a lot of countries where we work, but they're particularly they're particularly difficult in become more difficult in fragile settings. So what are we missing as evaluators, and what more could we do? What could we do better? And this is also a question for the audience, so please feel free to kind of chip in if you have experience and ideas of working, or you have experience and ideas from working in developing countries where things have worked, and also your views on how we could do evaluation differently and not evaluate the wrong things perfectly. So Stefan, let me start with you. I'm sorry if I drop out.
Thanks very much, Joanne. I think we're making progress. I think there is now a body of evaluative evidence out there that points to some direction. At the same time, I think we have to be very humble and acknowledge that we don't have the answers. No one does, right? Otherwise, they would be already implementing the right approaches and making designing effective instruments and effective operations. But I think, some of these issues, these recurring things, which are actually present in all of our institutions, but they're more urgent in FCS or FCAS and SIDS environments because of the capacity constraints. you can't have 15 different bilateral donors engaged with the country. The procurement issue, we don't have time for a year. So I'm not quite sure. I mean, it goes back to the question, right? Do we know what we're doing in these countries, and have we adapted the approach and the modalities to engage in FCAS and SIDS countries appropriately, right? And this is something where we have done some analysis, some evaluations, that certainly country programs are now much better informed by fragility analysis. But then, breaking it down into operational pieces, I think that's still a mixed picture. So, not everywhere is there a clear articulation of, recognizing underlying fragilities and, highlighting or emphasizing parts of the country strategy that are actually, that should be prioritized given the FCAS and SIDS situation of the country. So I think it's to that business model question, right? Are we fit for purpose? So I think progress has been made, but it's very slow progress. It's also linked to questions around incentives, right? Yeah. And how are staff rewarded? How are the institutions rewarded? Are we following volume targets? Or are we following targets, to go back to the private sector, of actually having impact on a local private sector, of developing a vibrant local private sector of small businesses, which we can't actually capture in our in our instruments. So I think it requires more wholesale change of the institutions to really implement this differentiated approach, which I fully agree with you. Probably many people, it's just a phrase. They don't know how to fill it with content. But what that means exactly, what to prioritize in the country, how to shift the business model and the processes and systems in the institution, and how to reward staff and incentivize staff and the institutions at the end of the day by the stakeholders. I think those are important questions. Back to you.
Thank you. David, I see you've got your hand up, and I'll come back to you, but it's really great that we've got some questions coming in from the floor, and I want to give them some attention if that's okay. So the first question we've got is a methodological question about, when you've got a lot of donors all working in one area, how do you deal with the attribution issue? How do you separate it out so you can show what a particular donor is doing? And I think the answer, and you can stop me if I'm wrong, is that it's actually quite difficult to separate out in any country the support that one donor provides. And I think there's also recognition that often one donor alone cannot provide the answer, right? So we have to work together more and more to produce a development outcome, and development aid in some countries is quite a small share of the overall economy. So to think that one partner can deliver an outcome alone is difficult. So I think trying to separate out what one donor does from another would be quite difficult unless it's something unique. We have another question from an anonymous attendee about do donors pay more attention to fragility rather than, or pay more attention to conflict rather than fragility? Hyun, do you want to comment on that?
Fragility and fragility versus conflict. That's a great question. ADB and other MDBs need to view institutional and socio-economic fragilities with the same urgency as conflict situations. After all, these fragilities are so deeply embedded in FCAS and SIDS that they make it difficult for development partners to operate and promote long-term development in this context. Fragilities in non-FCAS and non-SIDS context can lead to even social instability. I think Sri Lanka is a case in point where deepening economic crisis has spiraled into social unrest. Sri Lanka's economic fragility is brought about by fiscal challenges, soaring inflation, and disruptions to public services have led to social unrest in the country, right? So the crisis in Sri Lanka traces its roots from many years of economic mismanagement, leading to budget and current account deficits. The government in 2019 implemented huge tax cuts to give fiscal stimulus that accelerated the crisis. On top of all this, Sri Lanka was then locked out of capital markets as its credit ratings were downgraded. And with Sri Lanka running down its reserves of foreign currency, the government failed to make payments for key imports such as energy, leading to shortages and social unrest. So furthermore, I mean, Sri Lanka is facing food and fuel shortages. Food and fuel price hikes have devastating effects, especially for poor households, as you know, because they spend nearly half, or even more of their incomes on food and fuel compared with their non-poor counterparts. Maybe I can stop there if somebody else can come in, please.
Thanks, Hyun. I think I'll just move on to some of the other questions because there's quite a lot coming in. There's like a question from Melanie that asks how do we capture both positive and negative and unintended effects and impacts of projects and programs? And did anybody find specific methods and tools to be more effective than others in fragile settings? And she gives an example of doing a meta-evaluation of peace-building programs back in 2016, where they used outcome mapping and outcome harvesting to help capture some of the unintended effects. And so Melanie's curious to hear if the presenters had similar experiences, either using this tool or using any other tools. So Stefan, did you find that there were certain tools, evaluation tools, that work better than others?
No, I mean, I actually raised this mainly to make the point that this was a gap that we found, that, you know, project level evaluations basically follow the established standard methodology, tracking standard indicators and benchmarks. And there was no space actually to note any of those unintended effects, unless you know, the evaluator, the person preparing the assessment, noted it specifically, but it was not systematically captured. And so we noted that as basically a gap or a shortcoming of the current M&E system, because it did not actually allow us to draw any inferences on these higher level objectives. But I'd be interested to learn more about this project on outcome harvesting and so on.
I mean, Melanie, if you want to come off, if you want to come on camera or come off mute and say more, because I know that you're also saying that evaluators also need to work in a way that causes no harm. Rule number one of working in a fragile state. So Melanie, do you have anything to add? Do you want to add anything?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi, Melanie.
Oh, brilliant. Hi, everyone. Yes, I just wanted to hear whether there were any other methods that were being used by different evaluators, given the research that we had done on this meta-evaluation of peace building programs. So we didn't actually use outcome harvesting ourselves, but this was a finding from the meta-evaluation. So the evaluators that actually used these methods did capture more unintended effects and impacts than others. So we did find this quite interesting, because obviously that's a methodology that not everyone uses or is comfortable using, but it's worth nothing that it it is helpful in this context to capture those unintended positive or negative effects. And it's very similar to what you were saying earlier, Stephen, in regards to the evaluation frameworks. The tools are not adapted. And usually what we found is that exactly the same as you mentioned. The evaluators who actually included those questions in the questionnaires did find unintended effects or impacts, both negative or positive. Whether when they didn't include those questions, they wouldn't necessarily find that. So that was one of the findings. Over to you.
Okay, thank you for that, Lenny. There's also a comment really by Melinda, who's suggesting that you know, we have to change too as evaluators, and I like the comment from Melanie about using different methods, and there are quite a number of methods out there at the moment that are largely related to real-time evaluation. And a colleague of mine at the moment is doing a course, or just a one-day course on real-time evaluation, where they're using a term monitoring as evaluation. And when you're working in a highly changeable context, then monitoring as evaluation becomes a tool in itself, because it's important to be able to keep up to speed really with how the context is changing. We don't have a lot of time left, but Melinda, do you want to also come off? Do you also want to come on speaker and talk about real-time evaluation in fragile states? Is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, hi, thank you very much, Jo. Thanks for noticing the questions and points. Thanks to presenters for this evening. It's been really fantastic. So a lot of my specialisation's been in evaluation in PNG and the Pacific over the years. And one of the things that we were trialling in PNG when I was working for the Australian government was strategy testing. And that was a really useful tool to help operations to understand and examine their strategy and change it in real time. And it's a bit challenging because you're in the kitchen with the cooks while they're cooking, and people really need to want you in that space for you to be able to have the greatest impact, but that's a really useful tool. One of the things that we did for the ADB real-time evaluation of support to developing member countries for COVID was real-time evaluation case assessments out in 5 countries to help inform the board about perceptions of what the developing partners actually thought of the support that we were providing. And with Dave's support, we were able to undertake a mission to PNG virtually. And PNG is a really challenging place under the best of circumstances, and really, really challenging when everyone's scattered for lockdowns and they don't have the same consistent internet access as other people do. And the way you really engage with stakeholders really needs to be fit for purpose in the fragile operating environment. So you need to know what it is that really makes the country fragile from all kinds of political, economic and natural disaster perspectives. And you really need to understand the cultural nuances to enable people to open up to you and talk to you when you are virtual rather than face-to-face. And, you know, you have to draw so heavily on your networks and really try to encourage people to speak frankly with you. So one of the tools that we used was, we didn't actually evaluate our real-time evaluation notes that we were sharing with our board. We didn't publish them. So when they were confidential, the development partners and ADB staff who were talking with us knew that the information wasn't going to be conveyed broadly while people were still working and trying to figure out some of those complex issues. So by providing real-time information, we were able to help encourage course correction in different areas with the board where it was needed, and without a public view and without the same processes that you would normally put on a published document. So shorter times around all of the processes for getting documents to the board and elsewhere. And the information that you get from out in the field can be so challenging in this kind of time. So being able to access a country, especially a fragile country, is really valuable. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Melinda. We've got 2 minutes left, and I think that we'll probably just get thrown out of Zoom. So I'm gonna bring this to a close by first of all thanking Hyun and Stefan and David for their presentations, and thank you, David, particularly for your very frank overview of what it's like on the ground. I mean, what I've heard and what I'm taking away from this is a question really to me, and that is, how useful is ex post evaluation in these contexts? And you know, as evaluators, do we need to be shifting to real-time evaluation and better monitoring and evaluation, especially when you've got projects, David, that were approved, you know, decades ago, and you're now doing post-project completion reports. I mean, where is the data? Where is the evidence? Has it been collected over that 10 years? So you can look back and know what happened. And I also heard that there are a number of tools that are used in real-time evaluation that maybe we can start to explore as evaluators. So I heard real-time evaluation, adaptive processes, outcome harvesting, strategy testing, and I know there are other methods, but it seems like, to me anyway, that evaluating in these contexts is very hard if you do it ex post, given the high rate at which the context changes. So knowing what worked and why is really difficult ex post. That's my view. That's what I'm taking away from this. I hope that you're all taking away different and interesting points. Do let us know what they are. And thank you very much to the panel, and thank you to everyone for attending. I hope you found it useful. Thank you very much.